Between 1853 and 1854, 9 white overseers disappeared from plantations along the Ogeechee River corridor in southeastern Georgia. Local newspapers never reported the vanishings. County records list each man as simply relocated or moved west. But in the slave quarters of Burke County, whispered stories told a different truth. Stories of a pale figure who moved through the darkness, of screams that echoed from the cypress groves, and of skin found stretched and curing like leather in hidden places deep within the swamps. The enslaved population called him Devil's White, and they spoke his name only in the quietest moments, when overseers were far from earshot. Official records claim these men simply left Georgia for opportunities elsewhere. The enslaved people who lived through those 18 months knew better. Before we continue with the story of Devil's White and the terror that gripped the plantations of Burke County, I need to ask you something important. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our audience is discovering these forgotten American horrors. Now let's return to the nightmare that began in the autumn of 1853. Burke County, Georgia, in the early 1850s, was a landscape of brutal contradictions. The Ogeechee River carved through dense forests of cypress and tupelo, creating a maze of swamps and tributaries that planters had learned to harness for rice cultivation. The county sat in the heart of Georgia's Black Belt, where enslaved people outnumbered white residents by margins of 10 to 1 in some districts. Cotton ruled the uplands, rice dominated the lowland swamps, and human bondage made both possible. The Calhoun plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of this unforgiving terrain. Jeremiah Calhoun had inherited the property from his father in 1847, along with 237 enslaved people whose names appeared in his ledgers as mere livestock entries. Calhoun himself rarely visited the property, preferring his townhouse in Savannah, where he could conduct business and maintain the social standing expected of Georgia's planter class. The actual management of his property fell to a succession of overseers, white men typically drawn from the poor farming class who saw the position as their one opportunity to exercise power over others. The work on the Calhoun plantation was killing work. Rice cultivation required enslaved people to stand in water up to their waists for hours, their hands bleeding from handling the sharp stalks, their legs swelling from constant immersion. Dysentery, cholera, and malaria swept through the slave quarters with such regularity that Calhoun budgeted for the annual loss of human property, the way other planters budgeted for equipment replacement. The overseers who managed this nightmare were expected to extract maximum productivity regardless of human cost, and they were given absolute authority to achieve that goal through any means they deemed necessary. In October of 1853, an enslaved man arrived at the Calhoun plantation under unusual circumstances. The county records list him only as property transfer, male 28, albino, field hand, origin, Chatham County. He had no recorded name in any official document. The enslaved community would come to call him Silas, though whether this was a name he chose or one given to him remains unknown. What made Silas remarkable, and what would ultimately make him legendary, was his appearance. Complete albinism was rare among any population, but among enslaved Africans it created a particularly cruel set of circumstances. Silas's skin held no melanin whatsoever. It was pale as candle wax, prone to burning and blistering under the Georgia sun. His eyes were a washed-out blue that watered constantly in daylight, forcing him to squint against illumination that other workers tolerated easily. His hair grew white and fine, nothing like the coarse, dark hair typical of his people. This appearance had marked him as cursed or touched by something unnatural in the eyes of both enslaved and enslaver populations throughout his life. The records from Chatham County that accompanied his transfer were sparse but revealing. Silas had been sold 4 times in the previous 6 years, always after incidents the records described only as difficulties with management or unsuitability for cooperative labor. One notation from 1851 was more specific. Subject displays extreme resistance to correction. Previous owner reports 2 overseers injured during discipline attempts. Recommends sale to interior plantation where isolation can be maintained. Thomas Greer, the head overseer at the Calhoun plantation, was a man whose reputation preceded him throughout Burke County. At 43 years old, he had spent 2 decades managing enslaved labor across Georgia and South Carolina. He was known for what the planter class euphemistically called firm management, a term that concealed regular beatings, torture of those who worked too slowly, and sexual violence against enslaved women that produced a generation of mixed-race children he never acknowledged. Greer lived in a house near the main plantation buildings, a structure far superior to the slave quarters, but still modest compared to the main house that Jeremiah Calhoun occupied during his infrequent visits. Greer employed 8 assistant overseers to help manage the plantation's operations. These men came from similar backgrounds to Greer himself, poor whites who had grown up farming small plots, men who saw overseeing as their opportunity to rise above the poverty they'd been born into. They ranged in age from 22 to 51, and they shared a world view shaped by the brutal social hierarchies of the antebellum South. They understood that their position depended on maintaining absolute control over the enslaved population, and they enforced that control through calculated violence. When Silas arrived at the Calhoun plantation in late October, the assistant overseers responded to his appearance with immediate derision. One of them, a man named Wade Parsons, declared that Silas looked like something that crawled out of hell wearing the wrong skin. Another, Robert Finch, suggested that his pale appearance made him touched by the devil and predicted he wouldn't last a month in the rice fields. The enslaved population observed Silas with mixed reactions. Some viewed his condition with superstitious fear, others with the wary sympathy of people who understood what it meant to be marked as different in a world that punished difference without mercy. Thomas Greer assigned Silas to the rice fields, the most physically demanding and dangerous work on the plantation. The rice grew in fields that had been cleared from swampland, creating paddies that had to be flooded and drained according to the crop's growth cycle. Enslaved workers spent their days bent over in ankle-deep to waist-deep water, planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting rice under a sun that turned the landscape into a steam bath by midday. For someone with Silas's condition, this assignment was particularly brutal. His skin, unable to produce protective melanin, burned and blistered within hours of sun exposure. The constant water immersion caused his skin to crack and peel, creating wounds that refused to heal in the humid environment. Greer watched Silas's suffering with satisfaction rather than concern. In his view, the albino slave's pain was justice for whatever defiance had led to his multiple sales. When Silas worked more slowly than other enslaved people, struggling with vision problems and physical pain, Greer responded with the whip. The first beating occurred during Silas's 3rd day at the plantation, when he failed to complete his assigned section of the rice field before sunset. Greer had him tied to a post near the slave quarters and delivered 20 lashes, while the other enslaved workers were forced to watch, a standard technique meant to reinforce the consequences of inadequate productivity. What Greer noticed during that first beating was something that should have warned him. Silas made no sound. Most people being whipped screamed, begged, or at least grunted with each strike. Silas remained silent, his pale eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Greer's shoulder. When it was finished and he was cut down, Silas walked back to his quarters without limping or showing any sign of pain, though his back was striped with bleeding welts. The other enslaved people whispered about this afterward, noting that someone who could endure such punishment without crying out was someone to watch carefully. The routine of plantation life continued through November and into December of 1853. The weather turned colder, which brought some relief to Silas's sun-damaged skin, but introduced new miseries in the form of freezing water in the rice paddies. The workday began before dawn and continued until after sunset, with only brief breaks for meals of cornmeal and whatever vegetables the enslaved people could grow in their small garden plots. The overseers maintained control through constant surveillance and random violence, ensuring that fear remained the dominant emotional reality for the enslaved population. During these weeks, several enslaved people noticed that Silas disappeared sometimes during the brief hours between the end of work and the required return to quarters. No one knew where he went, though some reported seeing his pale figure moving toward the cypress groves that bordered the plantation's rice fields. These groves were dangerous territory, dense, swampy areas filled with cottonmouth snakes and alligators, places where even experienced woodsmen could become disoriented and lost. The fact that Silas ventured into these areas alone and always returned suggested either recklessness or an intimate knowledge of swamp navigation that seemed impossible for someone who had only recently arrived at the plantation. Christmas week brought a brief respite from labor, a tradition that most planters observed to maintain the illusion of paternalistic benevolence. The enslaved people received slightly better rations, a few hours of permitted celebration, and a temporary reduction in supervision. It was during this period that an enslaved woman named Delilah had a conversation with Silas that she would remember for the rest of her life. Delilah was 52 years old, a cook who worked in the plantation's main kitchen and had survived 3 decades of bondage through careful observation and strategic silence. She found Silas sitting alone near the quarters, his pale skin stark against the darkness. "They say you've been sold 4 times before coming here," Delilah said, settling herself on the ground near him. "They say you got troubles with overseers wherever you go." Silas didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. "Troubles find me. I don't go looking for them." "That man Greer," Delilah continued, "he's the worst kind. He'll kill you slow if you give him reason. I've seen him do it before. There was a man 3 years back, field hand named Joseph, who talked back once. Greer had him beaten so bad he died 2 days later. Didn't matter to Mr. Calhoun. He just bought another slave to replace him." "I know what Greer is," Silas said. His pale eyes caught the moonlight, giving them an eerie reflective quality. "I know what all of them are. And then you best keep your head down," Delilah advised. "Whatever you thinking about doing, whatever anger you carrying, you got to bury it deep. Anger gets us killed." Silas turned to look at her fully for the first time. Maybe anger is the only thing that keeps us alive. The conversation ended there, but Delilah would later testify that she felt a chill run through her body as he spoke those words, a sensation she couldn't explain but couldn't shake. The first disappearance occurred on January 7th, 1854. Wade Parsons, one of the assistant overseers, failed to appear for the morning assembly of enslaved workers. This was unusual because Parsons was known for his punctuality and his enthusiasm for the first beating of the day, which he considered essential for establishing the proper tone of fear and submission. When Parsons didn't appear by mid-morning, Thomas Greer sent another overseer, a man named Benjamin Strickland, to check Parsons's cabin. Strickland found the cabin empty. The bed was unmade, and Parsons' coat still hung on its peg near the door, suggesting he hadn't planned to go far. His rifle, which he normally carried everywhere, leaned against the wall. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, the food cold and untouched for hours. Nothing suggested violence or struggle. Parsons simply wasn't there. Greer organized a search party that included 3 other overseers and a group of enslaved men he considered trustworthy enough to assist without attempting escape. They combed the plantation grounds, the nearby woods, and the swamp edges. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of an accident. Wade Parsons had simply vanished as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The disappearance troubled Greer because it represented a loss of control. In the social order of the plantation, white overseers occupied a position of absolute authority. The idea that one could simply disappear suggested a breakdown in that order, a crack in the facade of invulnerability that maintained the entire system. Greer sent a message to Jeremiah Calhoun in Savannah, reporting Parsons's absence and speculating that the man might have gotten drunk and wandered off, possibly falling into the river or becoming lost in the swamps. The enslaved population responded to Parsons's disappearance with carefully concealed satisfaction. Parsons had been particularly cruel, known for whipping enslaved people for the smallest infractions and for targeting young women with sexual violence. His absence was a blessing, though no one dared speak this thought aloud. What they did whisper about, in the quiet hours after the overseers had retired, was the fact that Silas had been working in a rice field within sight of Parsons's last known location, and that several people had seen Parsons yelling at Silas the afternoon before his disappearance. 3 weeks passed. The rhythm of plantation life continued with one fewer overseer, a situation that increased the workload on the remaining white men, but didn't fundamentally alter the brutal reality of enslaved existence. Greer hired a replacement, a young man named Daniel Carmichael, who came from a farming family in Greene County and was eager to prove himself capable of managing enslaved labor. On February 3rd, Daniel Carmichael disappeared. The circumstances mirrored Parsons's vanishing so closely that Greer felt genuine alarm for the first time. Carmichael had been supervising work in the rice fields during the afternoon. When the enslaved workers were called back to quarters at sunset, Carmichael wasn't with them. A search of his cabin revealed the same details as Parsons's disappearance: a half-eaten meal, personal belongings undisturbed, no signs of violence or struggle. It was as if Carmichael had simply stopped existing mid-thought. This time, Greer expanded the search. He brought in men from neighboring plantations, experienced trackers who knew the swamps and forests. They found nothing. The slave patrols that regularly roamed the county roads were notified to watch for any suspicious activity. County authorities were quietly informed, though no official report was filed. Planters preferred to handle such matters privately, to avoid any appearance of vulnerability in their control over enslaved populations. The disappearances created a tension that hung over the Calhoun plantation like humidity before a storm. The remaining overseers began traveling in pairs, unwilling to be alone in areas where enslaved workers were present. They carried their weapons constantly and watched the enslaved population with increased suspicion. Random beatings increased as the overseers attempted to reassert control through intensified violence. The enslaved people endured this escalation with the grim resignation of people who understood that their survival depended on appearing compliant while revealing nothing. Silas continued his work in the rice fields with the same silent intensity he had displayed since arriving at the plantation. His skin bore the scars of constant sun damage and frequent beatings, creating a pattern of pale scar tissue over pink burns that gave him an even more unsettling appearance. The other enslaved workers began to avoid him, not out of dislike but out of fear that association with him might draw the overseer's suspicion. There was something about Silas that made people uncomfortable, a stillness in his manner, a complete absence of the fear that governed everyone else's behavior. On March 19th, 2 overseers disappeared on the same night. Robert Finch and a man named George Talbot had been assigned to night watch duty, a rotation that Greer had implemented after Carmichael's disappearance. They were supposed to patrol the area around the slave quarters and the main plantation buildings, watching for any suspicious activity. When morning came, both men were gone. Their rifles were found leaning against a tree at the edge of the cypress grove, positioned carefully as if someone had placed them there deliberately. A search of the grove itself revealed nothing but dense vegetation and dark water. Thomas Greer's response to the third and fourth disappearances revealed the depth of his alarm. He sent an urgent message to Jeremiah Calhoun, demanding that the owner return to the plantation immediately, describing the situation as critical and requiring direct intervention. While waiting for Calhoun's arrival, Greer implemented a series of measures designed to prevent further disappearances and to uncover whoever or whatever was responsible. All enslaved people were confined to their quarters from sunset to sunrise, with armed guards posted at every entrance. Anyone leaving the quarters for any reason would be shot without warning. The overseers worked in groups of 3 or more, never alone, and maintained constant visual contact with each other. Greer personally interrogated dozens of enslaved people, using torture when he deemed it necessary, trying to extract information about who might be responsible for the disappearances. These interrogations revealed nothing useful. Either the enslaved population genuinely knew nothing, or their silence was impenetrable. The white community of Burke County began to take notice of the situation, though the full extent of the disappearances remained concealed. Planters discussed the matter quietly at social gatherings, speculating about runaway slaves turned violent or possible outside interference from abolitionists. The presence of active resistance to slavery was a nightmare scenario for Georgia's planter class in 1854. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia remained vivid even 23 years after it occurred, a reminder that the enslaved population could and would fight back if given opportunity and leadership. Some planters suggested that the disappearances might be related to the tensions that were building across the South over the question of slavery's expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed just weeks before the first disappearance at the Calhoun plantation, had inflamed sectional tensions and prompted increased abolitionist activity. There were rumors of underground railroad networks extending deeper into Georgia than previously thought, and of northern agitators working to incite slave rebellions. These theories failed to explain why the disappeared men left no trace, but they provided a framework for understanding the situation that didn't require planters to confront the more disturbing possibility that someone or something was hunting white overseers with complete impunity. Jeremiah Calhoun arrived at his plantation on March 25th, accompanied by his personal secretary and 2 hired guards. Calhoun was a thin man of 56, dressed in the fine clothing that marked his social standing, visibly uncomfortable in the rural setting of his own property. He had inherited wealth and enslaved people, but had never developed the stomach for the actual mechanics of plantation management. That distaste had led him to rely entirely on overseers like Greer, allowing them free rein to manage his human property however they saw fit. The meeting between Calhoun and Greer took place in the plantation's main house, a substantial structure that had been built by Calhoun's father in the 1820s. Greer laid out the facts of the disappearances with military precision: dates, locations, circumstances, and the complete absence of evidence or witnesses. He also shared his growing conviction that someone among the enslaved population was responsible, though he admitted he had no proof and no suspects. "I've managed enslaved people for 20 years, Greer told Calhoun. "I know when they're planning something. There's a feeling in the air, a tension you can sense. But this is different. They're scared, truly scared, but not of us. They're scared of something else." Calhoun suggested bringing in the county sheriff and organizing an official investigation, but Greer immediately opposed this idea. An official investigation would create a public record of the plantation's inability to maintain order, potentially devaluing Calhoun's property and creating legal complications. The planter class maintained its authority partly through the illusion of complete control. Admitting that 4 white men had disappeared without explanation would shatter that illusion. Instead, they agreed on a different approach. Greer would hire additional overseers from outside Burke County, men who wouldn't be aware of the previous disappearances and who could provide fresh eyes on the situation. They would also implement a reward system, offering freedom to any enslaved person who provided information leading to the capture of whoever was responsible for the disappearances. This latter strategy was calculated to divide the enslaved population, turning them against each other in the hope that someone would betray useful information. The new overseers arrived in early April, 3 men recruited from rice plantations in South Carolina, all experienced in managing enslaved labor under harsh conditions. Their names were Marcus Sloan, Raymond Dodd, and Henry Fletcher. Greer briefed them on the plantation's operations, but deliberately omitted any mention of the disappearances, telling them only that the plantation had recently experienced management turnover and required additional supervision. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual occurred. The presence of new overseers and the increased security measures seemed to have stabilized the situation. Greer began to relax slightly, believing that the disappearances might have been the work of an outsider who had been frightened off by the enhanced security. Calhoun prepared to return to Savannah, satisfied that his property was now under proper control. On April 22nd, Marcus Sloan didn't return from the morning inspection of the rice fields. The discovery of Sloan's disappearance triggered panic among the remaining overseers. The pattern was breaking. Sloan had disappeared during daylight hours, while enslaved workers were present and under supervision. This suggested a boldness that made the previous disappearances seem almost cautious by comparison. Greer immediately ordered a lockdown of the entire plantation. All work stopped. Every enslaved person was confined to the quarters under armed guard. The remaining overseers, along with Calhoun's hired guards, conducted a systematic search of every structure and area on the plantation grounds. They found something this time. In the cypress grove, approximately half a mile from the rice fields where Sloan had been working, searchers discovered a clearing that showed signs of recent disturbance. The ground had been torn up in places, and there were marks in the soft earth that might have been drag marks, though the swampy conditions made precise interpretation impossible. More disturbing were the marks on several cypress trees. Deep gouges in the bark, as if something had been scraped against the wood with considerable force. Some of the gouges showed traces of what appeared to be blood. Though the amount was minimal and the condition made testing impossible, Greer ordered the search expanded to cover the entire cypress grove and the swamp areas beyond. This proved difficult. The terrain was treacherous, with hidden sinkholes, dense vegetation, and water that could reach waist-deep without warning. The searchers worked in groups, calling out to each other constantly to maintain contact. They found nothing else of significance. If Sloan had met his fate in that clearing, his body had been moved or hidden with remarkable effectiveness. The enslaved population was interrogated again, this time with increased violence. Greer's restraint, such as it was, had eroded completely. He personally oversaw torture sessions designed to extract information using techniques that left permanent physical damage. Several enslaved people died during these interrogations, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation. The survivors revealed nothing useful because they genuinely had nothing to reveal. Whatever was happening, the enslaved population was as ignorant of the details as Greer himself. One interrogation, however, produced an interesting detail. An elderly enslaved man named Caesar, who had worked on the plantation for 40 years and whose age had reduced him to light duties, mentioned that he had seen Silas near the cypress grove on several occasions. This observation wasn't particularly meaningful. Many enslaved people had reason to be near the grove for various work-related purposes. But when pressed, Caesar admitted that he had seen Silas entering the grove after dark, during the hours when all enslaved people were supposed to be confined to their quarters. Greer immediately ordered Silas brought to the main house for interrogation. The guards who went to fetch him found Silas in his assigned sleeping area in the quarters, lying on the rough wooden platform that served as his bed. He offered no resistance when they bound his hands and led him across the plantation grounds. His pale skin showed fresh bruises and healing wounds from recent beatings, and his eyes watered constantly in the afternoon sunlight, but his expression remained neutral, almost serene. The interrogation took place in a storage shed adjacent to the main house, a location Greer preferred for such activities because it was far enough from the slave quarters that screams wouldn't be overheard. Calhoun was present, along with Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the two remaining overseers who had arrived from South Carolina. Silas was stripped to the waist and chained to a post in the center of the shed, his arms pulled above his head in a position designed to cause maximum discomfort. Greer began with questions delivered in a deceptively calm voice. "You've been seen entering the cypress grove at night. Why?" Silas remained silent, his eyes focused on something beyond Greer's shoulder. "5 overseers have disappeared from this plantation in less than 4 months, Greer continued. "You arrived here shortly before the first disappearance. That's an interesting coincidence." Still silence. Greer nodded to Dodd, who stepped forward with a leather whip. The beating that followed was systematic and brutal, designed to inflict maximum pain without causing immediately life-threatening injuries. Dodd had experience with such work and understood how to pace the punishment to avoid killing the subject too quickly. Silas's back was torn open, blood running down his pale skin in stark red streams. He made no sound. His eyes never left that distant point he had fixed upon, and his body remained still except for the involuntary jerks caused by the whip's impact. After 20 lashes, Greer stopped the beating and tried questions again. Silas's silence remained absolute. They resumed the whipping, delivering another 20 lashes that left Silas's back a raw mass of torn flesh. Still, he made no sound. The men in the shed began to feel uncomfortable. There was something deeply unsettling about someone who could endure such punishment without crying out, without begging, without showing any sign that the pain affected him at all. "He's not human," Fletcher muttered. "No man can take that without making a sound." Greer, frustrated and increasingly unnerved, tried a different approach. He had Silas taken down from the post and secured in a sitting position. Then he ordered hot coals brought from the kitchen fires. The torture that followed involved pressing heated metal against Silas's skin, targeting areas that would produce intense pain without causing immediately fatal injuries. The smell of burning flesh filled the shed. Silas's pale eyes watered more heavily, but whether from pain or simply from the smoke was impossible to determine. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He barely moved. After 2 hours of this, even Calhoun, who had limited stomach for the realities of slavery, couldn't watch anymore and left the shed. Greer, Dodd, and Fletcher continued for another hour before finally stopping, not because they had gotten information, but because they were physically exhausted and psychologically disturbed by Silas's complete lack of response. They had him dragged back to the slave quarters, unconscious from blood loss and trauma, but somehow still alive. That night, April 22nd, 2 more overseers disappeared. Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the men who had participated in Silas's torture, were both assigned to guard duty at the main house. They were armed with rifles and positioned on opposite sides of the building, with instructions to call out to each other every 15 minutes to confirm they were alert and present. At midnight, Dodd called out. Fletcher responded. At 12:15, Dodd called out again. There was no response from Fletcher. Dodd immediately raised the alarm, and within minutes Greer and the remaining guards were searching the area. They found Fletcher's rifle leaning against the wall of the main house, exactly where he had been standing. His hat lay on the ground nearby. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Fletcher had simply vanished. The searchers fanned out across the plantation grounds, calling Fletcher's name and searching every building and area they could access in the darkness. 2 hours later, when they returned to the main house to regroup and plan a more systematic dawn search, they discovered that Raymond Dodd was also gone. His rifle remained at his post. His position showed no signs of disturbance. 7 white men had now disappeared from the Calhoun plantation in less than 4 months. Dawn on April 23rd revealed a plantation descending into chaos. The remaining white men, Thomas Greer, Jeremiah Calhoun, his secretary, and the 2 hired guards, gathered in the main house and barricaded themselves inside. They were outnumbered by the enslaved population 200 to 5, and the careful system of surveillance and control that had maintained order had completely collapsed. The situation was unprecedented in Greer's experience. Individual slave rebellions happened occasionally, escape attempts were common, even murders of overseers occurred on rare occasions. But this systematic elimination of authority figures was something else entirely. The enslaved population emerged from their quarters cautiously, uncertain what the new day would bring. The normal routine of forced labor didn't resume because there was no one to enforce it. The guards at the quarters had abandoned their posts during the night, retreating to the relative safety of the main house. For the first time in memory, the enslaved people of the Calhoun plantation experienced a morning without someone telling them what to do. Delilah, the cook, was one of the first to realize that Silas was missing. His sleeping area in the quarters was empty, the rough blanket that had covered him soaked with blood from his torture wounds, but without any sign of the man himself. Several people had checked on him during the night, concerned that he might die from his injuries. As recently as 4 hours before dawn, someone had seen him lying there, barely conscious, but breathing. Now, he was gone. The disappearance of Silas sparked intense debate among the enslaved population. Some argued that he had finally died from his injuries, and that someone had secretly removed the body to avoid questions. Others believed he had somehow recovered enough to walk away, perhaps fleeing into the swamps to escape further torture. A smaller group, mostly older people who had lived through decades of slavery and had developed a deep skepticism about coincidence, believed something else entirely. They believed that Silas had been the one responsible for the overseer's disappearances, and that his removal from the quarters meant the nightmare was entering its final phase. Inside the main house, Greer and Calhoun debated their options. Calhoun wanted to abandon the plantation immediately, returning to Savannah and sending federal troops to restore order. Greer argued that abandoning the property would result in the total loss of Calhoun's human chattel. The enslaved people would scatter into the swamps and forests, heading for free territory or simply disappearing into Georgia's backcountry where they might survive as fugitives for years. The enslaved population represented an investment of over $100,000, a fortune that Calhoun couldn't afford to lose. The compromise they reached was to send the secretary and 1 guard to Savannah with urgent messages for both federal authorities and neighboring planters, requesting immediate military intervention and assistance. The secretary left late in the morning, riding hard for Savannah with a letter from Calhoun describing the situation in carefully edited terms. He mentioned that several overseers had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but omitted the more disturbing details that might suggest a complete loss of control. That afternoon, while the secretary was still miles from Savannah, Greer made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to address the enslaved population directly, using a combination of threats and promises to try to restore some semblance of order. He had the remaining guard fire several rifle shots into the air to gather the enslaved people to the area in front of the main house. When they had assembled, a crowd of over 200 people, some curious, others fearful, all uncertain about what was happening, Greer emerged onto the front porch of the main house and spoke to them. "I know someone here knows what's been happening," Greer began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. 7 white men have disappeared from this plantation. That can't happen without someone knowing something. I'm offering freedom, legal, documented freedom, to anyone who provides information leading to whoever is responsible. You'll be given papers and transportation to wherever you want to go. No tricks, no lies, real freedom. The crowd remained silent. Greer continued, shifting from offer to threat. If no one comes forward, I'll burn these quarters to the ground with everyone in them. I'll see every last one of you dead before I let this plantation fall. You have until sundown to make your choice. The threat was likely empty. Greer couldn't kill 200 people without bringing down exactly the kind of official scrutiny that Calhoun was trying to avoid. But the enslaved population had no way of knowing that. They dispersed back to their quarters, gathering in small groups to discuss what to do. The general consensus was that no one knew anything useful. Silas had kept to himself, revealing nothing of his intentions, if indeed he had been responsible for anything. The disappearances had occurred without witnesses or evidence. There was nothing to tell, even if someone had wanted to claim the offered freedom. As afternoon faded toward evening, a young enslaved man named Caleb approached the main house. Caleb was 16 years old, quick-minded and desperate to escape slavery by any means available. He claimed to have information about the disappearances and requested permission to speak with Greer privately. The overseer, hopeful that his threat had worked, agreed. Caleb was brought into the main house and led to the room where Greer, Calhoun, and the remaining guard had established their command center. "I seen something," Caleb said, his eyes downcast in the submissive posture that enslaved people learned early. "I seen the pale one, Silas, going into the cypress grove at night, multiple times, and I seen him carrying things." "What kinds of things?" Greer demanded. "Couldn't tell for certain in the dark, sir, but they looked like bundles, heavy bundles that he carried over his shoulder. He was heading deep into the swamp, where the ground gets too wet for most folks to go." This information aligned with what Caesar had reported earlier about Silas entering the grove. Greer felt a surge of vindication. His instinct about Silas had been correct. The albino slave was somehow responsible for the disappearances, though the mechanism remained unclear. How could one man, subjected to constant surveillance and regular beatings, manage to abduct and kill 7 armed overseers without leaving evidence? "Can you lead us to where he went?" Greer asked Caleb. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied. "I can show you the path he took, but we'd need to go before full dark. Once night comes, that swamp ain't safe for nobody who don't know it proper." Greer considered this carefully. The sun was already low on the horizon, giving them perhaps an hour of usable daylight. Going into the cypress grove with limited visibility was dangerous, but waiting until morning meant another night of vulnerability. He made his decision quickly. "We go now, all of us." He turned to Calhoun. "You'll stay here with the doors barred. If we're not back by dawn, ride for Savannah yourself." Greer, the remaining guard, a man named Patterson, and Caleb prepared for the expedition. They armed themselves with rifles, knives, and a length of rope. Greer also brought a torch, though he hoped they wouldn't need it before returning. As they left the main house, dozens of enslaved people watched from the quarters, their faces unreadable in the fading light. Caleb led them toward the cypress grove, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew the terrain. The path he followed was barely visible, a slight depression in the ground that wound between massive cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation. Water began appearing in pools. Then, as a continuous shallow layer covering the ground, they were entering the deep swamp. "How much farther?" Greer asked after they'd walked for nearly 20 minutes. "Not far now, sir. There's a clearing up ahead, maybe 200 yards more." The light was failing rapidly. Greer decided they would investigate the clearing and then return immediately, rather than risk being caught in the swamp after dark. They pressed forward, their boots squelching in the muddy water. Strange sounds echoed through the grove. Bird calls, the splash of something moving through water, the creak of tree branches swaying in wind they couldn't feel down at ground level. The clearing, when they reached it, was larger than Greer expected. It was a roughly circular area, perhaps 50 feet across, where the cypress trees gave way to open space. The ground was slightly elevated here, creating a dry island in the surrounding wetland, and in the center of this clearing stood a structure that made all three men stop in their tracks. It was a framework built from cypress branches, lashed together with what appeared to be strips of leather. The structure stood about 8 feet tall and formed a rough, rectangular shape. Hanging from this framework were 9 objects that Greer's mind initially refused to identify. They swayed slightly in the breeze, and as he forced himself to look more carefully, understanding came with a wave of nausea. They were skins, human skins, stretched and cured like leather hides, still showing the recognizable features of faces, the texture of body hair, the shape of hands and feet. 9 complete human skins, carefully preserved and displayed like trophies. Greer recognized Wade Parsons by a distinctive scar on his left arm. Robert Finch's tattoo, an anchor he'd gotten during a brief stint in the Merchant Marine, was clearly visible on one of the suspended skins. The others were harder to identify individually, but the count matched perfectly. 9 overseers, all of them here. Patterson vomited immediately, the sound loud in the grove's unnatural silence. Caleb stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror. Greer felt his hand shaking as he raised his rifle, scanning the clearing for any sign of threat. This was far worse than murder. This was something that reached beyond the normal bounds of human violence into territory that seemed almost inhuman in its calculated cruelty. "We need to leave," Patterson gasped, wiping his mouth. "We need to get out of here right now." Before Greer could respond, Caleb spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "He's here. He's been here the whole time." Greer spun around, following Caleb's gaze. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light, stood Silas. His pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the gathering darkness. He was shirtless, his back still showing the raw wounds from yesterday's torture, but he stood upright with no sign of pain or weakness. In his right hand, he held a long knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. "Put down the knife and surrender," Greer commanded, raising his rifle. "It's over." Silas didn't move or speak. He simply stood there, watching them with those pale, watery eyes. Patterson raised his rifle as well, and for a moment the 3 armed men faced the single enslaved man across the clearing. The advantage should have been entirely with Greer's group. 3 against 1, rifles against a knife, Silas wounded and presumably weakened. But something in the moment felt wrong. Greer's finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated, a primal survival instinct warning him that the situation wasn't what it appeared. Caleb broke first. He turned and ran, splashing back along the path they'd taken into the grove. Patterson shouted after him, but didn't follow. Greer kept his rifle trained on Silas, who still hadn't moved. "I asked you questions yesterday," Greer said, his voice shaking slightly. "You didn't answer then. Answer now. Why did you kill them?" For the first time since arriving at the Calhoun plantation, Silas spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, with an accent that suggested education unusual for an enslaved person. "You already know why. You've always known." "That's not an answer," Greer said. "It's the only answer. They did what you do. They took what wasn't theirs. They hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. They thought being white and armed made them untouchable." Silas paused, tilting his head slightly. "They were wrong." Patterson fired his rifle. The shot was panicked and poorly aimed, the bullet striking a tree several feet to Silas's left. Before Patterson could reload, Silas moved. The speed of his movement was shocking, one moment standing still at the clearing's edge, the next closing the distance to Patterson in a blur of pale skin and flashing steel. The knife found Patterson's throat with surgical precision. The guard fell, blood pumping from the severed artery, dead before he hit the ground. Greer fired his rifle, but Silas had already moved again, circling around the framework of hanging skins. The bullet hit nothing but air. Greer tried to track him for another shot, but in the failing light and the confused shadows cast by the suspended skins, Silas seemed to disappear and reappear at random. Greer abandoned the rifle and drew his pistol, backing toward the path that led out of the clearing. "You can't escape," Silas said, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "This grove is mine. I know every path, every sinkhole, every hiding place. You're already dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet." Greer ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, following what he hoped was the path back to the plantation. Behind him, he could hear splashing footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always there. The darkness was nearly complete now, and he stumbled repeatedly over roots and through hidden pools of water. His lungs burned and his heart hammered in his chest. Branches whipped his face and tore at his clothes. He realized he was lost. The path had disappeared in the darkness, or he'd strayed from it in his panic. He was surrounded by cypress trees and black water, with no clear sense of direction. He stopped, trying to quiet his breathing enough to listen for pursuit. The grove was silent, except for the normal sounds of the swamp at night. Then he felt something touch his shoulder, just a light pressure, almost gentle. He spun around and saw Silas standing directly behind him, close enough that Greer could see the details of his wounds in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Please," Greer whispered, all his authority and cruelty stripped away, leaving only naked fear. "Please don't." Silas's pale eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. "Did they say, please, the people you beat, the women you violated, the children you sold away from their mothers? Did you stop when they begged?" Greer tried to raise his pistol, but his hand wouldn't obey him. Terror had locked his muscles, and he could only stand there as Silas reached forward with the knife. The last thing Thomas Greer saw was his own reflection in those colorless eyes. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Burke County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Caleb burst from the cypress grove in full panic, running toward the main house where Jeremiah Calhoun waited with the doors barred. He pounded on the entrance, screaming to be let in. Calhoun, hearing the genuine terror in the young man's voice, unbarred the door just long enough for Caleb to tumble inside before slamming and securing it again. "What happened?" Calhoun demanded. "Where's Greer? Where's Patterson?" Caleb was hyperventilating, barely able to form words. When he finally managed to speak, the story he told made Calhoun's blood run cold. The clearing, the framework, the skins, the appearance of Silas and the killing of Patterson before Caleb fled. He didn't know what had happened to Greer, but assumed the overseer was dead as well. Calhoun faced a terrible calculus. Dawn was still hours away. The secretary he'd sent to Savannah wouldn't reach the city until mid-morning at earliest, and even then it would take time to organize any kind of rescue party. He was alone in this house, with a 16-year-old enslaved boy, surrounded by 200 enslaved people who had every reason to hate him, and somewhere in the darkness outside was a man who had killed 10 white men with apparent ease. The night that followed was the longest of Jeremiah Calhoun's life. He sat in the main room with a rifle across his lap, starting at every sound. Caleb huddled in a corner, occasionally whimpering. The house creaked and settled. Outside, the normal sounds of the plantation at night seemed amplified and threatening. Dogs barking in the distance, wind moving through trees, the call of night birds. Around midnight, something scratched at the front door, just a light sound like fingernails drawn across wood. It continued for several minutes, then stopped. An hour later, it came again, this time at a window. Calhoun peered through the gap in the shutters, but saw nothing in the darkness outside. The scratching stopped. Silence returned. Near dawn, Calhoun heard voices. He recognized them as belonging to enslaved people from the quarters, multiple individuals engaged in what sounded like excited conversation. He risked another look through the shutters and saw figures moving in the growing light, people gathering near the path that led to the cypress grove. They seemed to be celebrating something, though he couldn't make out the details of their conversation. When full dawn arrived, Calhoun finally worked up the courage to open the door. The enslaved population had assembled in the open area between the main house and the quarters, every man, woman, and child on the plantation. They stood in a loose semicircle, all facing the cypress grove path. As Calhoun emerged onto the porch, they turned to look at him. Their expressions varied. Some showed fear, others satisfaction. Many displayed simple curiosity about what would happen next. From the path emerged Silas. He walked slowly, still shirtless, his wounded back visible to everyone. He carried something in his arms, a bundle wrapped in cloth that he handled carefully. The crowd parted to let him through, maintaining a respectful distance but showing no signs of aggression toward him. He walked to a point about 20 feet from the main house and stopped. "Mr. Calhoun," Silas called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I brought you something." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing Thomas Greer's head. The overseer's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide and mouth open as if in mid-scream. Silas placed it carefully on the ground, then straightened and looked directly at Calhoun. "This plantation operated on fear," Silas said. "You used fear to control us, to break us, to make us forget we were human. Now you understand what real fear feels like. Every man who tortured us, who violated our women, who separated our families, they all learned the same lesson. Fear is a weapon, but it can be turned around." Calhoun raised his rifle with shaking hands, pointing it at Silas. The enslaved population stirred uneasily, some moving forward as if to protect Silas, others backing away from the potential violence. Silas made no move to defend himself or retreat. "You can shoot me," Silas said calmly. "It won't change what's happened. It won't bring your overseers back. It won't restore your control. This plantation is finished, Mr. Calhoun. You just haven't accepted it yet." For a long moment, Calhoun stood frozen with the rifle aimed at Silas's chest. His finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze and the nightmare would end, or at least the man who represented the nightmare would end. But as he looked at the assembled enslaved people, Calhoun realized the truth of Silas's words. Even if he killed Silas, he was one man facing 200. The illusion of control that had maintained the plantation system was shattered beyond repair. He lowered the rifle. Silas nodded slowly, as if this was the response he'd expected. He turned and walked back toward the cypress grove. The enslaved population watched him go, then slowly began to disperse, returning to the quarters or moving toward the areas where they usually worked. But the work didn't resume. Without overseers to enforce it, without the systematic violence that had structured every hour of plantation life, the entire social order had simply stopped functioning. Jeremiah Calhoun's secretary returned that afternoon with a detachment of 20 soldiers from the federal garrison in Savannah, along with the county sheriff and a judge. What they found was a plantation in a state of limbo. The enslaved population remained on the property but performed no work. Calhoun sat on the porch of the main house, rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. When questioned about the situation, he told a carefully edited version of events. 10 overseers had disappeared or been killed. The perpetrator was an enslaved man who had since fled into the swamps, and the plantation required federal intervention to restore order. The soldiers conducted a search of the plantation, including the cypress grove. They found the clearing with its gruesome framework of preserved human skins, exactly as Caleb had described. They found Patterson's body near the clearing and Greer's headless corpse deeper in the swamp. The other bodies were never recovered. The skins were removed and burned, and the clearing was abandoned. A manhunt was organized for Silas, with slave patrols and military units combing Burke County and the surrounding areas. They found no trace of him. It was as if he had dissolved into the swamps like morning mist. Some speculated that he died from his torture wounds somewhere deep in the wetlands. Others believed he'd made his way north, joining the thousands of enslaved people who followed the Underground Railroad to freedom. A few whispered that he was still out there in the cypress groves, watching and waiting. The Calhoun plantation never recovered. Without overseers willing to take the position, news of the disappearances had spread throughout Georgia. Despite Calhoun's attempts at secrecy, the property couldn't operate. Calhoun attempted to sell the plantation and its enslaved population as a single unit, but found no buyers. The property's reputation made it worthless. Within a year, Calhoun had sold the enslaved people individually to other planters, dispersing them across the South, and abandoned the land itself. The main house was eventually burned, whether by accident or arson was never determined. The slave quarters stood empty for decades before finally collapsing. The story of Devil's White circulated through the enslaved communities of Georgia and beyond, changing with each retelling but maintaining its essential elements. An albino enslaved man, tortured beyond endurance, had hunted and killed 9 white overseers before vanishing into legend. The story served different purposes for different audiences. For enslaved people, it was a story of resistance and revenge, a reminder that even the most brutal system contained the seeds of its own destruction. For white Southerners, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient control, though they rarely admitted this publicly. One detail that was left out of most official accounts was discovered by a historian researching Burke County records in the 1920s. Among the documents related to the Calhoun plantation, she found a bill of sale dated 1853 for the purchase of an enslaved man from Chatham County. The notation on the sale mentioned that the individual being sold had been trained as a tanner, a person skilled in preserving and preparing animal hides. This single detail suggested a disturbing possibility about why Silas possessed the knowledge necessary to preserve human skins with such skill. The cypress grove, where the clearing stood, eventually returned to wilderness as the plantation around it was abandoned. Local people avoided the area, claiming it felt wrong somehow, though they couldn't articulate exactly what they meant. In the 1890s, a logging company attempted to harvest timber from the grove, but workers refused to enter after several men reported seeing a pale figure watching them from between the trees. The company eventually wrote off the grove as inaccessible and moved their operations elsewhere. During the Civil War, Burke County saw limited action, but the abandoned Calhoun plantation served as a temporary camp for both Confederate and Union forces at different times. Soldiers from both armies reported strange occurrences in the area, unexplained sounds from the cypress grove, the sensation of being watched, equipment going missing and then reappearing in unusual locations. One Union officer noted in his diary that his men refused to patrol near the grove after dark, claiming they could hear screaming coming from deep within the swamp. In the decades following emancipation, some of the formerly enslaved people from the Calhoun plantation were interviewed as part of various historical documentation projects. Their accounts of the events of 1853 to 1854 were remarkably consistent in the basic facts, but varied wildly in their interpretation of what Silas had been. Some described him as a man driven to justified violence by unbearable cruelty. Others spoke of him in almost mythological terms, as if he had been something more than human, a force of retribution given physical form. One elderly woman interviewed in 1903 stated simply, "Devil's White wasn't no devil. He was what we needed him to be. He was our answer when we couldn't find no other answer." The true fate of Silas remains unknown. Records from northern states contain no clear matches for an albino escaped slave arriving during 1854, though the Underground Railroad deliberately left minimal documentation. Some researchers have speculated that he died from his injuries shortly after leaving the plantation, his body lost in the vast swamps of southeastern Georgia. Others point to occasional reports from subsequent decades, rumors of a pale man seen in swamplands across the South, always appearing in areas where plantation cruelty was particularly severe, always vanishing before authorities could investigate. This mystery shows us how the most brutal systems can give rise to equally brutal resistance, and how terror, once unleashed, recognizes no boundaries. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Silas survived, or did he disappear into the swamps forever? Was he justified in his actions, or did his revenge cross lines that should never be crossed, regardless of the circumstances? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of history holds more secrets than we can imagine, and we'll continue exploring them together. See you in the next video.